Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm Dr. Nicole, and on today's episode, we're talking about the connection between food, depression, anxiety, and mental health in general. You know, the saying you are what you eat is so true when it comes to mental health and brain function for our kids and for us. I know that many of you are aware of the importance of diet when it comes to supporting your child's health and improving symptoms in the areas of things like learning, attention, mood, behavior, all of those things. But did you know that there are specific foods that actually provide the most benefit for our brain? And it doesn't have to be super difficult to work them into our kids' meals, our families' meals, and our snacks each day. So to provide us with some information and insight on this topic, I've invited Dr. Drew Ramsey on the show. Let me tell you a bit about him. He's a psychiatrist, author, farmer, teacher, and advocate who's a longtime proponent of the healing power of food, understanding the dietary change to help balance moods, sharpen brain function, and improve mental health. He's an assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons and is in active clinical practice in New York City. His work and writing have been featured by all kinds of publications, and he's been named a Kale evangelist. I'm going to ask him about that. He's made appearances on many of the big shows that you all have seen. He's also the author of 4 books, including his new one out right now called Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety. Dr. Ramsey is also a father, so he gets the challenges and practical issues involved with feeding kids and a family every day. Dr. Ramsey, welcome to the show.
Dr. Nicole, it's really great to be here with you. Thank you. And hi to everybody who's listening. I'm really looking forward to spending a little time with you and talking about nutrition and mental health.
I've been so looking forward to this conversation, and I know that the audience is just going to love not only you and your interesting combination of backgrounds and things that you bring to the discussion, but also the really practical tips. I want to start out with this because I know that there, are probably people who heard the intro and the bio and they're like, wait, psychiatrist talking about nutrition, farmer. Tell us from the outset here, how did you get interested in this? Because most psychiatrists do not talk about nutrition or certainly are not farmers. So talk to us about how this interest in nutrition and food developed for you.
For sure. Well, the farming comes, I grew up on a farm in Indiana. My parents moved out to really rural Indiana in the late 70s. And we don't have a big, dairy or cattle farm. We've got basically a big forest and some pasture. But they got really interested. They were part of this back to the land movement of starting to grow more food, and really the first kind of generation of folks who got interested in things like organic food and how we can grow our own food and store some of our own food. And so that's just always influenced me as I went through college and medical school. I was really curious about nutrition. I was an athlete in multiple sports. And at that point, I was a low-fat vegetarian, really trying to optimize my health through food, even back then. I think the way they kind of all came together is I completed my training in adult psychiatry at Columbia in New York City and began to really think about this merger of my personal and professional life in some ways when it came to food. It seems odd to me. I was spending so much time thinking about, how to get enough protein and what vegetables I was going to try. And in my professional life, I wasn't talking about food at all. And so as I think everybody listening and Dr. Close, when you see those kind of things where your life doesn't meet up, eventually they're going to. And it did for me, just from my clinical work of prescribing medications and seeing people gain weight or not, or lose weight, and having to get involved with asking people what they eat. And it just really organically evolved that I began asking all of my patients what they eat. The data started to come out. I got really interested in how to pull this information together and wrote my first book, The Happiness Diet. Then I got really interested in kale and leafy greens and kind of how do we use media to create mental health and public health messaging around food, and wrote 50 Shades of Kale and then Eat Complete. And then throughout this whole time, all this evidence had been coming out. And so this new book really was written over the last year during the pandemic, but it's really been inspired by the new research. And also I was at a phase of my life where I was commuting back and forth between Indiana and New York at that point. We moved back from New York City into the farmhouse with my folks. And so I was really in this very, for me, like unique vantage point, it felt like, of I'm getting to really experience the attitudes and values and nutritional landscape of Manhattan on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday. And then the rest of the week, I'm in really rural Indiana, where, the closest supermarket is like Walmart. And so, which is 25 minutes away. And so I think that I appreciate what you said. It's just, but to me, I think it feels just, it's kind of like, I don't know, I love food, I love mental health. I kind of get all mashed up in my brain. I try and do some creative stuff with it in the world via social media and the books. And I hope it inspires people to start paying attention and feeding their mental health.
I love that phrase, feeding your mental health. I think it's so perfect because that's really what we're talking about. And most people don't understand that those things go together. The things that sort of naturally came together for you just from different aspects of your life. It's like, oh yeah, food, mental health, that works. Most people think about those things as being really separate. I think the typical discussion around, or how we talk about mental health or different kinds of diagnoses doesn't involve a discussion about what we're eating. It's sort of like that dichotomy of our physical health, which is where most people think of nutrition, right? How we eat to, maintain our weight or those kinds of things, versus mental health. And what you're really talking about and what I talk about is those things are really connected and inseparable.
Exactly. And it makes sense. I mean, we make it sound like it's separate because it's the brain, but the brain's just part of your body. And it's also striking to me, Dr. Nicole, the disconnect you're talking about, because we all know when we don't eat well, we don't feel well. When we do eat well, we feel a little better. We all, especially parents, right? We all know it's like, man, those kids, they get psychotic and irrational and just mean and, tearful. And then you guys are like, oh, it's because I haven't fed you. And then you feed them and they're like lovely creatures again, right? It's just sort of, people sometimes ask me like, what's the evidence for nutritional psychiatry? And I say like, do you have kids?
Right.
And so, there's that acute part, but then there's the data about the longer term implication, which I do agree. I don't think most of us think about. I didn't think about, and this data didn't exist, that if you eat a more traditional quality diet, there's, at least in populations that eat more traditional quality diets, though, there's a decreased risk of depression between, let's say, 30 to 50%. In the meta-analysis of all the dietary quality studies in depression, they find a 19% decrease in the risk of depression for people who have the healthiest diets compared to people who are eating lots and lots of processed foods. Then there's the treatment data now. For the first time ever, we have multiple randomized clinical trials showing that adding on food, a food intervention, usually a Mediterranean style diet or something like that, adding that on to treatment as usual gets more people into full remission. Up to a third more people end up in full remission, at least in the SMILES trial by Felice Jacka. And so that's where I think it's really time for us all to double down on our efforts about our mental health. I mean, the pandemic is really causing us to do that, but also these places where it's not like something new. You don't have to like go see Dr. Nicole once a week or twice a week. Or I need to see her like 4 times a week. I'm going to book that right after the podcast. I need the full deal. Right. Or take maybe a medicine. I prescribe lots of medicines. I think they're really helpful and they work for a variety of conditions. I also appreciate people are anxious about them and have concerns, especially parents in giving meds to kids. And so the thing that's nice about food is you're doing it every day, and not in a like, oh gosh, your kid has depression or anxiety because you didn't feed them right. I really don't like turning it around like that. Instead, I really like to think about it as an opportunity that if you're not eating well, or if I wouldn't even think about it like that. I'm just thinking about if there are foods that are really nutrient dense. In the book, Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety, I call them the power players, and they're just a representative of food categories. So everybody, like seafood is one of the food categories that's really important for mental health. That's where we get the long-chain omega-3 fats. It's really the best protein source in terms of just kind of thinking about nutritional benefit. A lot of kids don't eat seafood or struggle with that. So how can we make that accessible? So the power players are wild salmon and anchovies, which now that sounds like foods kids are not going to eat, but I've got a great wild salmon burger, a little pan seared, really easy to make using canned salmon. So super easy on the budget. Our kids devour them. I really have to test all these recipes on the children. Or something like dashi. Dashi is the base seafood broth, basically, and kombu seaweed that is in a lot of ramen and noodle dishes that kids tend to love. So there's a great soba dashi recipe in the book. So those might sound like a little bit of a stretch, but there's also just easy things for families, like the buckwheat cacao pancakes. We just had those this morning. Incredibly nutrient dense pancake. And it kind of illustrates nutrient density. Like, think about our typical parent pancake, like flour, a little bit of honey or sugar, milk, egg, baking soda, right? That's like, and maybe some blueberries in there if we're worried about brain health. And so the buckwheat cacao pancake really takes the pancake to a whole nother level, where we use a buckwheat flour, which is a gluten-free flour. We sweeten with bananas. We put in some flax seeds or oats. And then we finish it off with cacao nibs. So cacao nibs, it's what you make chocolate out of, cacao beans, but they're very high in phytonutrients and antioxidants. They're really high in magnesium and iron, and they make the whole this kitchen smell like you're roasting chocolate. But again, they don't have the sugar that milk chocolate does. And just a really good example of taking something that doesn't really have any role in a healthy, like, pancakes are great, but they're not bringing anything to the table really nutrition wise, and turning it into something that really is very, very nutrient dense and great for your brain health.
I love that example because pancakes are something that kids tend to gravitate towards that they're eating. And I want to go a little bit deeper with this idea of nutrient density, because I think a lot of people, they say, well, my kid's growing fine. Like, I take them in for their physicals every year and they're growing physically. And so what I'm feeding them seems fine, they're growing. And then we have conversations around, though, the difference between heavily processed foods versus more whole foods and nutrient density, and why that matters. And I think that that's something for people to really think about. And I'd love for you to expand on, just because we can be feeding ourselves or our kids a diet where physically they seem okay, doesn't necessarily mean that we're giving our brains everything that is needed to really thrive and function well, right?
That's for sure true. I mean, the human brain is made to exist on anything. We on the planet, we have the most diverse diet of anything because we can eat anything. If you drop me in a foreign country and I don't recognize a single food, I'm going to go to bed tonight full. Someone's going to feed me something. I might not recognize it, but I'll digest it and I'll turn it into brain fuel. And also kids, and particularly adolescents, their brains are really in some ways short-sighted, because when a brain is growing like that really rapidly, thousands of calories dedicated towards new bones, new brain cells, like our kids are 7 and 10, and so they're just, I mean, like every day they get out of bed and it's like, oh my gosh, like where's my child, who's this big creature? And so that makes kids crave carbohydrates and sugars, because to the brain, those signal safe calories. Sweet means safe. And I say that because I think as parents, we often like scold our kids, or like, get down on ourselves. Like, oh, I can't believe our kids want ice cream again. We give it to them too much. And I learned that from the Monell Center for Science and Taste. And it's really stayed with me that, again, to think about that as a nutritional psychiatrist, how can we use that to our advantage? How can I use that sweet taste to help expand my kids' palates into fruits? How can I use that sweet taste to get on some more fermented foods, like using kefir in their smoothies? How can I use it to make a pancake, something that they love, can help me cook, but also there's lots of pumpkin seeds and oatmeal and flaxseed in those pancakes, not hidden away. I'm not like a lie to the kids and hide it, but just in a nutrient dense way. And just to define that again, as Dr. Nicole said, this is an equation, simple equation of the number of nutrients that a food has, how much vitamin C and zinc and iron and whatever nutrients you're interested in, over how many calories. And so it's a really easy measure of, why does a can of Coke no good for us? You can talk about the sugars and the inflammation, but an easy way is just, it has nothing in terms of nutrition. It just brings calorie, just brings the gasoline to the engine. And what we want is foods that bring lots of nutrients with their calories. So a good example is an oyster. One East Coast oyster just has 10 calories. So 6 oysters, 60 calories. For those 60 calories, you get 500% of your daily need of zinc. You get 250% of your daily need of vitamin B12. You get almost 1,000 milligrams of long-chain omega-3 fats. You get iodine. You get, I think, 100 and something percentage of your selenium, right? Lots and lots of nutrition for 60 calories. So that's nutrient density, and why it also makes sense. If you want to eat the fewest calories possible, the only way to do that is focusing on eating the most nutrient dense foods.
Mhm. Yeah, and which is good for us physically and for our brain. Let's delve a little bit more into what the research has shown are some of the most important nutrients. I mean, certainly they're all important, right? Eating a broad, varied diet that incorporates, the full complement of vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients. That's what we want to be doing. But the research has shown that there are sort of some standouts when we think about brain function, brain health, mental health, right? Talk to us about those.
So the most important nutrients we found in our work have been the antidepressant nutrients, is what we focused on. Laura Lachance is a psychiatrist in Montreal. She and I partnered up and worked on the antidepressant food scale. And so we looked at all the depression literature and found that there are 12 nutrients with significant levels of evidence that they influence the prevention and treatment of depression. And so some of them do matter more: B vitamins, B9 and B12 in particular. And then in all of my work, my really goal is to take that, where people then think, oh, more B12, maybe I should get a B12 supplement,
Right.
and instead really ask you to translate that into food.
Yeah.
And it feels, I think, like a lot to keep track of, right? Like which food has B12, which food has omega-3 fats, which foods have magnesium. And so that's why we look to food categories, because there's certain categories of food that just have more of these nutrients. So long-chain omega-3 fats, the only place you're going to find those really in concentrated forms that will make a difference in your brain health is in fatty fish. Um, and so that then leads you towards wild salmon and anchovies and bivalves, mussels, clams, and oysters. Um, the some of the nutrients that I really love to focus on: potassium and white beans and bananas, really important for nerve conduction, and also for anybody who's I had a little like heart arrhythmia that often happens when you have low potassium. I love focusing on magnesium. It's one of these nutrients that's linked. One of the things I focus on in the book is this idea of neuroplasticity or brain growth. So magnesium is one of the few nutrients that's really linked to the genetic expression of what's called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And this is a neurohormone. There's that is a molecule in the brain that leads to the birth of new brain cells. It leads to brain cells repairing themselves and healing. So it's a very, very powerful, what's called neurotrophin. So magnesium's linked to BDNF, and so that leads me to eating more greens and beans and other high magnesium foods. Another nutrient that I really like is vitamin A, because there's both the plant forms of the carotenoids like beta carotene that we turn into vitamin A, and then there's retinol, actual vitamin A, that we get from foods like liver and and meat. And so those are some of the nutrients that we focus on in the book. One of the things I tried to do, because I just think it is so much kind of information, is I tried to really illustrate for people a little detail about each nutrient, how much you're supposed to get, what foods you find them in a nice illustration for each of the 12 nutrients, as well as some of these concepts we're talking about, that people hear about, like, the microbiome.
Right.
And just to try and give people as many kind of different avenues for exploring these ideas. So I'm a really visual learner, and so I can read, but then I get distracted, and I love to see things. And I find when I see an image, really sticks in my head. And so I hope to give those resources to people. And there's also 30 recipes in the book, and some of them are formulas to try and, again, your question is really around key nutrients. And so as you can hear, taking those nutrients, thinking about what foods have the most of them, and then how do we come up with recipes that make those foods really delicious for us?
Which is key, because if things aren't relatively simple and tasty, we're not going to incorporate them into our diet, right?
For sure.
We're just not even as adults, forget about kids. So that's why I love the practicality that you bring to it, and the visuals. Every time that I've heard you speak, or a lot of the things that you do online too, you do incorporate those visuals, and I think those are so helpful for us to just really see and be able to internalize the overlap with these things. Like, it can be overwhelming when people hear, oh, there's all these nutrients I should be focused on. But here's the good news: when you look at the lists of foods that contain those nutrients, there's a lot of overlap there. And so if we're incorporating certain types of more nutrient dense foods into our diet, chances are we're ticking a lot of those boxes just in those foods or in those meals that we're preparing. And that makes it a lot simpler than thinking about, oh, each of these things is going to be in something different and I have to figure it all out.
Well, I think that's exactly right, Nicole. And it's where two things you're saying. One is by focusing on the nutrient dense foods, excuse me, you really don't need to worry that much.
Right.
And I think that's a really important lesson for people, because there's so much messaging and fear for parents. Mm-hmm. You're not giving enough of this, you're not giving enough of that. And that's where parents all end up giving kids like chewies and multivitamins and gummies and stuff like that, right? Because it's like safe. Yeah. And I think there's another approach where we focus on these nutrient dense foods and we focus on helping our kids enjoy them, not, forcing them on them. The other part that you mentioned or touched on is how these foods crowd out the foods that we think are driving things like inflammation, obesity, diabetes, and in the mental health world, kind of some piece of the depression, anxiety, ADHD story for kids. That as you're on more processed foods, as you're eating more sugars and refined vegetable oils and food dyes and food fillers and have dysregulated blood sugar and extra weight gain from all those foods, there's the consequence of those, that when you crowd that stuff off your plate by you're eating more plants, more seafood, more nuts and beans, you just get lots of health benefits because you've gotten off the it's one of the reasons, people always, when they come to see me, they say, oh, I've heard lots of, vegans who feel amazing when they go vegan, and carnivores who feel amazing when they go carnivore, and paleo and Whole30. And people's like, well, why do all these diets work? And the thing that connects all of these diets is you're getting people off of processed foods. And that is, no matter what you're doing, that is the most important step.
Yeah, I totally agree. To me, that's the foundation of all of it. I'll have families come in and they've read about all these specific kinds of diets or elimination diets, or they're focusing on taking all of the things out of the diet. And sometimes that can be important and necessary. But if we don't start from a foundation of good nutrient dense whole foods, before we start looking at what we're going to take out or whatever, we can really run into some problems, because you can be on a specialized diet and still have a lot of nutrient poor, junk in the diet. Gluten-free is a great example of that, right? It is entirely possible to have your child on a gluten-free diet and have it not be very nutrient dense and not very supportive of health. So that idea of really starting from that foundation of, a good variety of nutrient dense foods, and then, pushing that in first, especially for kids, adding things in before we start taking things away.
Yeah, I think that's it's a way we think about it in the clinic is there's so much fear-based marketing around food and messaging around food. And I love the idea of adding things in, just as you said, when people are talking about, all the processed foods they're eating, instead of like, we have to stop that, we say like, hey, you need a healthy snack. It sounds like that's going to give you energy. If you, what's your relationship with an avocado like?
Right.
Have you tried dark chocolate covered almonds? What kind of nuts do you like? What are some, have you ever tried this? What are some barriers to accessing it? Where do you shop and get your food? All these questions that I'd never asked as a psychiatrist, but then as I started asking them, I just learned so much about my patients, so many details about their lives that I'd never really considered, that of course they've never thought to, not going to come and tell me like, hey, I'm really super disorganized in the kitchen. I never spend any time cooking meals. I'm really that frustration tolerance that you're talking about, Ramsey. Boy, it's caused me to like break all my dishes and I just order in now.
Yeah.
Like, you learn so much about how people care for themselves by asking them how they feed themselves. And it's really become, in some ways, one of my favorite diagnostic tools. And I love that we're talking about it now, Dr. Nicole, because I think as we come out of the pandemic, families in some ways have been in this state they've never been in before. They've cooked everything themselves for like a year. So everybody's kind of sick of that. And at the same time, it's probably the healthiest any of us have eaten in the last years, because we've been, no matter what stuff you picked up at the grocery store, there's still a lot of whole foods going into people just by the nature of cooking at home for the most part, not universally true. But as we think about how to survive 2021 and really get back to a stance of resilience, having proper nutrition is just really at the center of that.
So true. I want to touch on, you mentioned the idea of power foods, and you talked about things like salmon and, bivalves and those kinds of things. give us some other ones that you think are really some of those power foods that, as we're thinking about helping families push more of these nutrient dense foods in their diets, what should they be thinking about? What are some starting points?
So in my book, I call them the power players, and some of my favorites, and we just go through the kind of food categories. So things like arugula and kale, right, in the leafy green category. Now, if you don't like either one of those, that's fine. There's lots of other leafy greens, but kind of falling in love with the leafy green, and it could be a purple green, like if radicchio is your thing, that's great. That's just as healthy as kale. There are pumpkin seeds and cashews. Pepitas or pumpkin seeds are a great source of tryptophan, great source of iron and magnesium. Really, really easy to use. A lot of the power players, one of the reasons we pick them is not only do they have so much nutrient density, but they also are just so what we call culinarily versatile.
Yeah.
When I've got some cashews, I can put that in a smoothie. I can have that in a snack. I can chop that up in my stir fry. I can chop it up in my salad. I can roast those nuts and have them as I'm sipping a cup of tea by the fire later at night. So there's lots and lots of ways to use these foods. Some of the other ones, seafood is a really important category. The power players that we emphasize are wild salmon, anchovies, and the bivalves, mussels, clams, and oysters, with really easy, tasty recipes for each of those. Another of the power players is dark chocolate. And this surprises people. They're not used to doctors prescribing candy, but I didn't do this as a marketing ploy, Dr. Nicole. I did this just based on the science. And if you look, for example, correlationally, people who consume a serving of dark chocolate every day have a 60 to 70% decreased risk of depression. At least there's an association. And so you kind of wonder, like, what does that mean? And then you get into the biology of what does chocolate do? And we think of it as a treat, but as you get dark chocolate above 70%, you start eating really a pretty pure cacao bean. And cacao beans have these amazing family of phytonutrients called flavonols. And flavonols, we think about phytonutrients in plants as antioxidants, right? You always hear like, oh, this plant has a lot of antioxidants, but they're probably not actually antioxidants in the body. There's some data that really suggests the main way that these molecules work is by influencing the microbiome and also by being cell-signaling molecules, so turning genes on and off. And so there have been some studies of cacao and cacao extracts that have been shown to improve memory, to reverse cognitive decline or age-related cognitive decline. And there have even been a few little trials of like showing dark chocolate can help medical students cope with stress better. And so dark chocolate's on there. It's one of the power players. And those are a few. Red peppers is another one I love because they're so high in vitamin C. And so as everybody's listening and hearing those foods, there are some things that are maybe, missing, like blueberries are usually on the list. And I just want to emphasize, it's not that these foods are the only foods, or if you eat these foods, you can get off all your meds or never go to therapy. It's more that these foods are great examples of nutrient density. There are lots of other brain foods besides this list, but I thought it was just a good starting point to give people. Avocados on there, of course.
Yeah, avocado is a great one. And avocado, I think, is a nice starting point for a lot of kids too, because it's mild. You can work it into things, you don't have to just sit down and eat it. You can work it into things. But with the dark chocolate, what I was going to, say for parents listening, that I have found a lot of success with in the clinic. Most kids like chocolate, not all, but most do. And, if they're starting out with more of like a milk chocolate kind of thing, you can shift their palate because you can get dark chocolate in all kinds of percentages. And so you can start with something that's just got a low amount of dark chocolate in it, and you can work your way up. And it's a really simple and lovely way to just start to shift a child's palate away from the super sweet kind of artificial chocolate to more of the dark chocolate. And you can do that gradually over time. And it's a really nice way to do that. And they feel like they're getting a treat, and it's just, you don't get into power struggles over it.
I completely agree. And I like that, dialing that in and kind of letting the palate, a lot of what they don't tell us about parenting is it's kind of, like they tell us about the palate expanders that our kids need, before braces, right? But they don't tell us about palate expansion. The kids often don't really tell the truth about food. He's like, do you like this? No. Do you like this? Yes. And then you get it and they don't eat it. And you're like, what? but that if we think about our job as really just providing experiences, empowering kids, shifting palate over time. Another thing with the dark chocolate I do is make it a high quality dark chocolate, but have there be, I don't know, dried cherries in there, or where you're adding in a natural sweetness as opposed to sugar. But mostly we want people eating solid chocolate. But if there's a little, I don't know, candied ginger in there, or an almond, or something else that adds a texture that your kid likes that helps it be a darker chocolate, that's great. My daughter loves dark chocolate covered almonds. Mm-hmm. Like a great snack for us.
Even if you need to start with something like if your child loves like pretzel sticks, like dipping that in, you start with where you need to start. And that's the piece about this that I just always try to emphasize for parents and families is there is no perfect in this. You don't have to jump from wherever you're at to some kind of ideal. We're all on a journey with this. And as long as we're aware of and shifting and even taking small steps towards the direction of more nutrient dense foods, towards the direction that we want to go, that's a good thing. And I think especially with what we're dealing with right now, with all the increased stress and just everything of the last year, we need to stop focusing on, well, it's this way, or I have to focus on, getting to this perfect or ideal place. And I just want people to get started and dive in somewhere. And like good enough is good enough at a certain level. That's how I think about it.
Perfect is the enemy of good. And I think that since there is no perfect meal and there is no perfect nutrition and there is no perfect food, I completely agree, Dr. Nicole. And I think it's also where, the medical establishment and wellness establishment, I don't think has really been that helpful. That people feel overwhelmed. They feel, it's like the debate is like butter or no butter. It's like, I mean, are you freaking kidding me? How many calories come from butter? Like, even if I eat a fair amount of butter, put a pat on my toast, I like it on vegetables. We're talking like such a minor part of my diet. That's not where the debate should be. The debate should be around, hey, how can you enjoy more seafood? Or, hey, if you're a big meat eater, how can you get to healthier cuts? How can you move towards grass-fed beef? How can you get involved in more beef stews, right? How can you maybe expand the meat cuts you use to make like I don't know, beef shank stew? So I think that there are places for all of us. That's how we work in the clinic. We call it simple swaps. Of just, how can we find a swap? How can we make a little step for you that's everybody's gonna feel good about? It's not like, oh wow, you've totally revamped everything in the last 5 days, and like that's not how change works, as you know.
Right. And even if people do that, it's not sustainable. And I see that with families too. It's like, okay, we're gonna dive in, we're gonna do this big thing, and even the ones that do it, it's like, but over time, your interest wanes or you can't sustain it. And I think we need to be about meaningful and sustainable for families, for kids, and ultimately what we're doing with food, even as we're making these shifts, what we're doing is educating our kids. We're modeling things for them. This is part of the raising them to become adults who can think about these things and make informed choices and decide for themselves how to handle this and have some experience with how food makes them feel, and even the cooking of it, what it is like that's part of our parenting, is to raise our kids to get to the point where they can make these decisions for themselves and hopefully make some choices around food in ways that support them in adulthood.
No, I completely agree, Nicole. I mean, it's certainly as a parent, one of the things that I've found most pleasurable is when my daughter said last night, she said, can I help cut that up? It was just like music to my ears, right? That when they get engaged, when they start, slicing and dicing and chopping, and I really feel like I'm passing them some of the skills that have been most important to me in my life. Not that I'm an amazing chef or anything, but I like the feeling of independence and self-nourishment and also creativity and confidence. As I open up the fridge and I usually have some fun. I figure something out, and I love that. I think it's funny. I did a little cooking class with the Aspen Brain Institute, and as we're getting ready, I was talking to the founder, and we're doing this Zoom class, and I'm going to make this anchovy dish. And I'd say, oh, do you like anchovies? And she says, no, I don't. I run back to the pantry and I change up for a jar of sardines. And I make this dish, and we sort of joke, we call it, gnocchi a la Glenda, right? It's like a sardine Glenda. And then My Invited Green just had a little post about this recipe. And, it just, to me, what it represents is the fun and the creativity and the expansiveness that food can offer us and that nutrition can offer us when we approach it from a stance of joyfulness and creativity and nourishment, not from a stance of fear.
Mm. Love it. Love it. So let's make sure everybody knows where they can get the book. It's out right now. So the Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety. Tell us where we can find it, how people can find out more about you and what you're doing.
Sure. Well, thank you, Dr. Nicole, and thank you everybody for listening. I'd love you to check out the book because I really think it's going to help you feed your mental health. And the book is available everywhere books are sold. I ask people to really, if possible, support your local bookstores. You can learn more about the book on my website, drewramseymd.com. We've got great information about the book. We also have some great downloads. If you're not buying a book, but you want some information on simple swaps, we also have a great newsletter, Friday Feels, where we kind of highlight some of our favorite mental health and brain food information on the internet every week. And then for any clinicians listening, we've got our great e-course, Nutritional Psychiatry for Healthcare Practitioners, which is the first ever course for clinicians who want to learn about applying nutritional psychiatry in their practice, as well as a course for the public called Eat to Beat Depression. That's and then Instagram. I should say the word Instagram because that's where I'm kind of most active.
Yep.
I update my stories pretty much every day, and I try and have some fun on there. And so if you give me a follow on Instagram, I'll probably make you laugh at least once, and I'll definitely encourage you to eat a lot of dark chocolate, leafy greens, nuts, beans, seeds, and wild seafood.
Yeah. Your social media is great. I really want to encourage everybody. You should definitely follow Dr. Ramsey on social media. Just lots of great practical stuff. And it is fun and it's engaging and it's great stuff that you put out there. And we'll put all the links to all those things in the show notes too, for all of you to be able to access those resources. Really have my highest recommendation, the book, all of the things that you put out there, I think are really important for families, for individuals, for those of us who are practitioners. You're doing really important work in bringing these concepts and things more into the mainstream. So thank you for that.
Well, Dr. Nicole, thank you so much. It's such a nice opportunity to meet up with you after meeting us a couple years ago at that wonderful Food is Medicine conference up in Traverse City. And so I really appreciate your efforts at spreading the word and really helping families embrace holistic mental health and get services and for all the care that you provide. And I hope you also are taking good care of yourself because as we know, this is challenging, stressful work and at a challenging time, but it's been a real pleasure. I hope everybody feeds their mental health this week and takes good care of those around you. And thank you so much for letting me come on.
Thank you. It's been great to have you. And thanks as always to all of you for listening. We'll catch you back here next week for our next episode of the Better Behavior Show.